I'm Joanne Wilson, and this is Positively Gotham Gal. Real, honest, and meaningful conversations with women entrepreneurs about their approach to life, business, and everything in between.
Well, hi, great to meet you, Joanne. I've heard great things about you.
Great to meet you too. Where are you?
I'm in New York. I grew up in Milan, so I have an appreciation for looking put together and fashion, generally speaking. But today is a sport mode day, so here we go.
All right, here we go. So we're just going to start. So you were born in Milan. I mean,
I was born in Milan.
You have zero accent whatsoever.
Yeah, my mom's Italian and my dad's American, and they're both professors. So they were really adamant about wanting to raise perfectly bilingual children. So they basically said, we'll each speak to our kids in our native language. And so the end result was that we speak both English and Italian, and we sound like native speakers in both cases. And yeah, it's worked out. I can always, be a spy or whatever if this whole tech investing thing doesn't work out. Trouble is nobody really cares to spy on Italy. It's a very unexciting place to spy on. You'd hear about some cappuccinos, but not much else. So yeah.
So funny. That's great. So did you go to school in over here?
Yeah. So I finished high school in Milan. Decided to move to the US for college just because I felt I would have more opportunities if I studied in English. And in Milan, the number of university programs in English is rather limited. And so I considered one, but then decided I really didn't want to go that route. And so I came to the US, ended up going to school at Penn State. My father's from Pennsylvania. And so basically I finished high school early. And so they were like, oh, well, you can't really go off and do this, go on the other side of the world and go to college by yourself because you're not even 18 years old yet. And I was like, whatever, I'll fax you the things you need to sign on my behalf, very large and in charge at 17. And so they said, okay, well, we'll come to the States as well. So they actually moved to the US because of me. So it's quite an adventure.
Other siblings here too, or you're
Yeah. My brother Lorenzo got dragged around in my wake. No, I'm kidding. He was very excited to come to the US as well. I think he'd always, we grew up coming to the States during the summers, and he loved coming here. And I think also for him, like, he's just had an incredible amount of opportunity that would be really off the table if we were still in Italy. He's a developer now. And, if you see even for equivalent jobs, how much more you make in the US compared to Italy, it's just like night and day, not only financially, but also, again, just in terms of opportunities. And so
right.
I think for both of us, it was 100% the right move to come here. And, very glad we did.
I get it. So when you graduated, were you always drawn to the tech world? I mean, that's something, certainly, here and when you were in school, that was like the height of the moment, right? Everyone's talking about tech and the internet and all the back end technologies. And so were you drawn to that? Is that where you wanted to be? Or is it just sort of you fell into it and that's ended up where you ended up being?
Yeah, it was a little bit of a falling into, in the sense that so basically because I was finishing college too early, I like a semester early, I double majored and had a minor, but I was still like wrapping up early because I'd come in with a bunch of credits and like to take too many classes. And so I was like, okay, well, what can I do for a semester? And so I ended up going and doing ecology research in South Africa. And so one of the projects we were doing required us to basically identify different plant species. So I was literally like wandering around the forest with this giant tome of a book, trying to figure out like what sort of trees and stuff I was looking at. And I had an idea, and obviously many of these exist now, but they didn't at the time. I was like, oh, well, wouldn't it be nice if you had an app where you could take a picture of like a leaf or a bark, and it would at least narrow down the universe of possibilities of what it might be.
Shazam for trees.
Literally, exactly. Shazam for trees. Yeah. So I came back to the US and I was like, well, I want to start working on this idea, and I had a couple friends who were engineers, so we started building this together. At some point in the process, I realized that actually my life's work was not going to be making Shazam for trees, and that I didn't really want to spend the next. It was a much more complex problem than I had anticipated, and so I didn't really want to spend the next like 10 years of my life doing that. But the team was good, and so we ended up saying, "Well, let's work together, but let's work on something else." And so we ended up getting into an accelerator in Princeton. So the summer after I graduated from college, we all lived in Princeton and were there sort of with other companies working in tech and building startups basically. And that was sort of my first like foray into this universe. I think from my perspective, it was incredibly exciting to see, just the ability to build something and make something new, and that whole ecosystem was really appealing to me because initially I thought, oh, maybe I'll work at the State Department or maybe I'll work for the UN or something. And when I dug in a little, I realized that my personality might not be a great fit in the sense that, I think the UN, like organizations like that, even the best intention can sometimes end up being very bureaucratic
Yeah.
or
Yeah. I mean, it's a lot like nonprofits. It's just like you want to do well in the world, but they they run at a very different pace,
yeah.
and there's a lot of layers involved. And for someone who's entrepreneurial, that's really frustrating.
Exactly. And that was the conclusion I came to. I interned at a nonprofit the summer before my last year of college. And I was like, okay, so basically 90% of the organization's time is spent trying to come up with more money
Yeah.
rather than actually doing the thing. So I was like, I'm not sure that
Like government.
exactly. Exactly. So I was like,
Politicians. Mm.
yeah. So I was like, that's probably not what I want to be doing. I think that sets me up for like a life of frustration. And so tech just made a lot of sense to me. I was like, oh, cool. We could just like build things and have them improve society in ways that are like, self-funding, rather than sort of relying on, handouts or charity or anything like that.
Well, it's intellectually stimulating, right? So you're around a bunch of people that are super smart, synapses moving, and are always thinking about what's next when they wake up every morning. And
Yep.
I think, and there's always been people like that, but that platform of technology allows you, the opportunity to do that. And when you hit upon something, you can just keep going.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Just the velocity, the ability to sort of take control of your own destiny a little bit more rather than sort of, the thing that's frustrating in some of these organizations, again, even the best intentioned is like, you could work for 3 years on some sort of, human rights thing, and then China vetoes it and like, cool, that's done. And so um startups are super hard and running a fund is super hard, but I think there are certainly things that can happen outside your control, but there's a little bit more agency, I think, and that felt really important to me.
So did you start after that, move yourself into a startup?
Yes. So the startup that I'd started sort of didn't work out, and I ended up saying, okay, I want to get some actual experience at another startup. So I went to a company called Shoptiques, very early
I
stage.
remember Stop Takes.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Also in New York.
You pitched me.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, exactly. And I think after that I decided I wanted to get big company experience because I felt like I'd always had to sort of figure things out on my own, and I was like, "Oh, it might be nice to go somewhere where they're doing things right." Um Now, I think I vastly miscalibrated um how professional I thought Facebook was. Meaning just that there was still a lot of startup energy. Granted, this was 7 years ago, so it was quite a while ago, but um the things that I had sort of made up in terms of like how to sell or how to handle clients and stuff like that were actually shockingly similar to best practices at Facebook. So that was good. But yeah, I mean, I think it just made me realize that in a lot of ways, what people think is hard to do is very different than what is actually hard to do. Meaning, at the time, when I joined Facebook, they told me at one point um, that there were 1,800 applicants for my job, which means that that's a much lower acceptance rate than all the best schools or whatever. But the thing that was interesting was that doing the day to day at Shoptiques or any startup, I think is way harder because you're not coming in and selling Facebook, which everybody is buying, or at least was buying in the ads business back in the day, but rather you're having to create the value proposition from scratch. You're having to educate people on who you are and what you do and build that sort of trust from scratch rather than just having brand recognition. Now, of course, Facebook has run into some, trust issues in
For
more recent years, but
sure. And I don't think any of us are
definitely.
that surprised, but it's certainly in the thing that I believe is the most interesting parts of a startup. If you have a startup mentality, is that you can wear several hats every single day. And some
Right.
people are very suited to build, and some people are very suited to take a build and then take it to a next. And other people are suited to take that next to be whatever it may be, public sell, whatever. And I think there's very few people that have the chops to take it from start to finish. And many have, but the question is, do many really enjoy it, or they just happen to be very smart? And I think that
Right.
it's important to go after things that not only you good at, but you like.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And I think for me, what I realized, now that I'm an investor, there are some parts of what I do that definitely overlap a lot with sort of my past lives at Facebook and at startups, specifically on the sales side, because I think the great news is that entrepreneurs have options today. And so many times when it's not necessarily always us saying, "Oh, do we want to do this deal or not?" But it's like, "Oh, cool, this company has 7 term sheets, go win the deal." And so there's definitely an element of sales and sort of, building the relationship with the entrepreneur and the sort of human connection piece that I really liked both at Facebook and at the startups I've been at. The thing I love, I think, even more about investing is the fact that it brings together also the ability to like think about the future and trends and where technology is headed,
Mhm.
rather than just having the human element. It really marries the two very nicely. And so I think for me, that's why investing is just like absolutely what I want to spend the rest of my life doing. Because it's fun, you build a relationship, like, I love working with founders, but you also, I think, get to think about trends, and that's really exciting to me.
Yeah, that's very true. I mean, listen, I think that anyone who is the top of their game has to be a good salesperson, because
Yeah.
you
All
do.
roles converge to sales.
I
Yeah.
mean, it doesn't matter what you do. If you're an artist, if you're a winemaker, I mean, there is an element that you have to sell yourself.
Yeah.
And I've seen many founders who have incredible products, but once they get into that room with human beings, selling is just not their thing. And um, once they get past that, uh, they're actually scarred from the entire process. So cryptocurrencies, that's what I really want to talk about. So how did you get into crypto? I mean, is it just something that you were paying attention to and intellectually you're just like, this is really where things are going and this is fascinating?
So, it actually goes back to my second trip to Africa, which, happened basically right after I left Shoptiques. I had a friend who was doing work for a nonprofit in Namibia, and we had this sort of joking pact that we might go, traveling around the continent together if, we both happened to be free at the same time. And so I, left Shoptiques. I messaged her. I said, "Hey, I'm available. What are you doing? Let's go wander around Africa together." And she said, "Well, actually, I just took a job in Namibia. I'm starting on Monday. Why don't you come here?" And I was like, Namibia, okay. So I booked the ticket on a whim. And once I got there, I was like, well, Namibia is cool. I'll travel around there for a while. And then I also really wanted to go to Victoria Falls. So I went to the Zimbabwean side of Victoria Falls. And once I got there, I noticed that they were using US dollars. And that was, interesting because I think probably I'd read somewhere that they'd had very bad hyperinflation, but I wasn't, particularly well versed in the topic. And so I started asking people who lived there about sort of what had happened and why they were using US dollars and all of that. And so I had some very interesting conversations about it. Very sad.
Why were they using US dollars?
Well, so basically their president slash dictator, Robert Mugabe, I mean, I wish I were joking, but
Well, I know you're not.
yeah, exactly. Started printing money to pay off his military entourage. And this sparked a bout of runaway hyperinflation. So, at its peak, the currency was losing half of its value on a daily basis, which means that, people's savings were completely wiped out in very short order. And so that meant
You wake up in the morning and you can't afford to buy a loaf of bread.
100%. As a result, the grocery stores were empty. The hospitals had no medication. I spoke to a woman who told me her child had died because there was no penicillin. And here you would go and, get penicillin and in, 24, 48 hours, I don't know, I'm not a doctor, but in very short order, you'd be fine. And there, the situation was so dire that many people ended up dying and were certainly economically devastated across the board. So, I was very much saddened to hear about this, and it sort of stayed with me. So I came back to the U.S. And a friend of mine who, actually, funny enough, I had met in Princeton at the accelerator I mentioned, told me, well, this would be a non-issue with Bitcoin because Bitcoin is deflationary. And I was like, what's Bitcoin? So this was early 2013. I started reading about it. I read the white paper, and I remember having this sort of classic epiphany moment, which Brian Armstrong from Coinbase has also described. And it's funny, I read an interview of his describing his experience, and I was like, that is the exact experience that I had, which was I read it. I didn't get 100% of it the first time around, but I was like, holy smokes, like if this works, this is the most interesting thing that I've ever seen, and I think has the potential to change a lot of things. Of course, there were many ways in which it could have not worked or whatever, but it just seemed like such a fascinating, unique kind of thing. It's like this whole system that was not controlled by a company, not controlled by a government, like really just its own category of thing.
Yes, it has the potential to be a financial foundation that will change the world. And as we're more connected as a universe, certainly more through COVID, as we realize that we aren't really in silos, we're really all connected. And cryptocurrency, in many ways, puts the onus back on us as people versus people that want to decide how we use the currencies.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And I think, like, obviously I couldn't have forecasted all of this at the time and seen the evolution from Bitcoin to Ethereum, now to Web3, and all of these fascinating applications that go way beyond purely monetary applications. But even then, it sort of struck me as something that was very important. And so I fell very deep down the rabbit hole. I started doing tons of reading. And I think it's such an interesting space because it pulls together so many different disciplines. There's elements of economics and elements of game theory and cryptography and all kinds of computer science, like all kinds of stuff. And so it was basically an infinitely rich exploration space. And so I started, in addition to reading a lot, writing some. And at the time, again, the space was very small. Everybody kind of knew each other. And so I quickly made a number of connections in the space. And one of my blog posts was actually about a company called BitGo, which had been, well, it was about a technology, which was multi-signature wallets, which basically allowed you to have sort of redundancy in the event that you lost a key to your wallet. And this company BitGo was sort of the first one to commercialize the technology. So I wrote a blog post about it. And because I'm a little bit shameless, I emailed it to the CEO and I was like, oh, I wrote a blog post and I mentioned you guys, you might want to put it on your website. And they were like, oh, this is great. Thank you so much. We will do that. Also, we should have lunch, which was the CEO's way of saying maybe we're going to hire you. I didn't really realize that at the time. Surprisingly naive sometimes, but yeah. So I ended up going out and met with them, and that was sort of how I moved into the space full time back in 2014.
And so I would love you to describe, what is the importance of cryptocurrencies and why, there's so many different currencies and so many things happening, and just like, and now we've discussed sort of like the exciting part of the innovation, but if you could just describe in super quick bulletin, what is cryptocurrency and why, should we all be paying attention?
Sure. Yeah. So, I think Bitcoin was the first cryptocurrency that reached mainstream adoption. And obviously it's now taken on something of a digital gold role where it's not particularly moving quickly in terms of innovation that's happening there. It's sort of like it sends payments, you store Bitcoin, that's about it. And in that sense, it's sort of a little bit stationary, but that can also be a good thing because if it's mainly meant to store value, you don't necessarily want to be experimenting with hundreds of billions of dollars of value. So it's sort of a little bit the lack of change is more a feature than a bug in some ways. But what it did, I think, is catalyze this whole movement of other, quote unquote cryptocurrencies. But, I think the word cryptocurrency can be a little bit limiting in the sense that they've now become really protocols and systems that go way beyond currencies. They're enabling things that go well beyond just financial applications. And so Ethereum really catalyzed, a movement of developers who started to build different kinds of applications that all, in some way used the Ethereum blockchain, Ethereum Ether as a token, but, enabled users to do all different kinds of things. And if we look at what's happening now with Web3, which is this kind of reinvention of the internet in
Mhm.
some ways with blockchain sort of at the core, we're seeing the ability for users to become real stakeholders in these networks in the way that users were never able to be stakeholders in Web 2. So, a company like Facebook, for example, has generated how many gajillions of dollars off of its users' attention. Does that money go back to the users? No, not really. And so what we're seeing now, however, is that the new generation of crypto companies is instead passing way more of that value back to users. So
More equality.
definitely, definitely. And a game like Axie Infinity, which sort of exploded this year in popularity, they're on track to do $1 billion this year, actually gives over 95% of its revenue back to its users. And so that's like I think the critical thing to keep in mind that's at the core of a lot of the innovation that's happening at Web3. It gives the value and the ownership and the control back to users rather than keeping it in the hands of sort of the middleman or the platform.
So when Jamie Dimon says this whole thing is crap, is like worthless, is it that he doesn't understand it, or is it fear of losing control of the largest bank in the world?
I think it's the latter more than anything. Well, frankly, I think it's probably a little bit of both. Let's put it let's put it this way. I have never found anyone who really got crypto or Web3 who remained negative on it. Like, many times these conversations are very difficult to have because I'm all for, like, reasonable debate, and all technologies have pros and cons. That's pretty much a given. But in most cases there is a fundamental lack of understanding that I think underlies a lot of the criticism.
Yeah.
Now, if you think about a bank, banks are very much beneficiaries of the current state of affairs, in many cases to the detriment of their users.
A
And
hundred
so,
percent. And it's just gotten worse over the past really 2 decades.
yes. Who loves their bank? Like, no one.
Nobody. I mean, we could both tell millions of stories, but certainly when you go back to the early days, 1950, you go in, you see Mr. Smith, you get a bank loan, and that's pretty much what they did. You kept your money in the bank. And then
Yeah.
over time, I mean, they have diversified into so many areas that, quite frankly, they are too big to fail. And I don't think the only way they can fail is if currencies in cryptocurrencies rise and allow people such Namibia,
Yeah.
use those currencies that float through rest of Africa and then move over to Europe and then move over to here, and that those transactions become seamless no matter what it may be between individuals, no matter where they're living.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And I think, in many cases, I mean, this happens across industries. Like, the old guard is pretty much never um, enthusiastically ushering in the next wave of technology. And so I'm
No.
kind of like, okay, Jamie, like, it's not like you don't have a vested interest here. It's pretty obvious that you're benefiting very actively from the current state of affairs, again, to the detriment of consumers. And so, you know, the way we're thinking about it is, wouldn't it be better if more of the value flowed back to the people who are, using the products and creating the value themselves, rather than being held by entities like JP Morgan.
Totally.
So, yeah. So,
And then you started Autonomous Partners.
mhm.
Now, did you start that under the umbrella of Andreessen, or did you start that on your own?
I started that on my own. So that was actually pre Andreessen. So the way it happened is basically, so in 2015, the fund that I started with my partner Ticon was really sort of, we started working together because we were both very excited about crypto, but there wasn't enough investable material in that category at the time to focus there exclusively. So we invested in seed and Series A companies kind of across multiple sectors. We invested in a lot of YC companies because that was kind of our network. And I think from my perspective, I continued to be very excited about crypto, but there just wasn't, enough for a full fund.
That's changed.
That has most definitely changed. Oh my gosh. Yeah, I know. My diminishing number of hours of sleep are definitely a testament to that. We've been very busy. Yeah. So but it's great. It's very exciting. There's so much happening. And even in 2017, when the last sort of crypto boom happened, all of a sudden there was this Cambrian explosion of projects and protocols and just really interesting stuff. Great entrepreneurs moving into the space, just a whole new wave of innovation. And so I said, okay, now the time is right. So I started Autonomous, which was really meant to be sort of a crypto fund investing across multiple subsectors in the space, investing in both coins and tokens and equity. And that's actually how I met the folks at Andreessen, because we happened to do a lot of the same investments. And so, we just kind of became aware of each other in that way. And so they ended up recruiting me to join the team. And so I joined in early 2020, and I still manage my fund as well.
That's great. So, I mean, you became a partner at age 30, even though, of course, you still, started your own company, but you also went into an industry that has been predominantly male. I mean, I've gone to so many events where women are like, can you please explain this to me? Why aren't there more of us in it? And how has that been for you? I mean, just talking to you, I'm sure that it isn't something that you think about first and foremost, but there is something about walking to a room of only men, knowing that you probably know more about the currencies than they do.
Yeah, I think my approach was always that, well, if you can do it, I can do it too. And the interesting thing about a new space is that everybody's a beginner. And so I was like, well, cool. I've been in crypto for 6 months and you've also been in crypto for 6 months. And so it doesn't, I didn't feel this particular, I just was like, well, if I spend time studying this and teach myself, like I'll be just as qualified as anybody else. And so that was sort of my mentality going into it. Frankly, I think a lot of times there's more of a confidence gap than there is a skill gap. I see like women saying, "Oh, but nobody's taught me about this. I don't have a degree in this." And I'm like, "You think these bros have degrees or no?" Like they just sort of started doing it and figured it out along the way.
Yeah,
So,
they faked it till they make it. I mean, that's pretty much it. I
right.
agree. And you have to be interested in obviously what it's all
Of
about,
course.
right?
Yeah.
So, yeah. So are you seeing more women enter this space?
Yeah, I think there's definitely more way more now than there were a few years ago. And I think the really exciting thing now is that crypto is eating everything in some way. So it's no longer just, a very technical infrastructure type thing, but we're seeing it touch areas like media and art and, other kinds of categories that have historically been much more female dominated. And
Mhm.
so I think it's really great because as crypto converges with culture and consumer experiences and things like that, I think the balance is definitely becoming much more yeah, there's just more of a balance there. And so I think that's great. It's very cool. Now crypto is not just its own category, but it's becoming really a piece of the stack. So a technology or a form factor that different industries can adopt rather than just like its own thing. So now you get, you know, crypto games companies and you get crypto consumer companies and all these things. And, they're really consumer companies that are using pieces of blockchain technology or NFTs or tokens or what have you um, to do whatever it is that they do. Interface with consumers, reward their users, whatever. But that's very cool because I think it's really similar to how the internet evolved, right? Initially, you had web
Exactly
companies.
similar. How did the internet involve? It is the exact same thing, which is why it's, to me, very exciting to see a whole new generation of people get super excited, because this is how it happened when the internet began. Everyone is just like, oh my God, this is something really different that's going to fundamentally change how we all live our lives and interact with things. And when people started talking about the blockchain and not understanding it, but to me, it was always the back end foundation that's going to build the next generation of companies.
Yes.
It's not like I want to invest in the blockchain. It's like, no, it's your platform.
Right.
Yeah, and I just think it's the more people are talking about it, the more people will understand. Yes, it is certainly complicated and there's a lot of different moving parts, but if you can describe it simplistic in a very simple way, it's just not that hard to understand.
Right. And by the way, I think the other piece is that, like, as technology matures, more of the complexity is abstracted away from most users.
Yeah,
So, like, you don't have to know what an ISP is or, how certain, pieces of the internet stack work in order to go online. And so I think in the same way, like at the beginning you used to, but now you don't. And so in the same way, crypto is also going to become much more usable. It has become much more usable. I mean, people still complain now, and that's certainly valid to some extent, but I feel like a little bit of a grandma, but I'm like, well, you should have seen it 10 years ago,
right. No,
back in my day.
it's like building an app. I mean, it used to be like you had to build it, right? Now,
Right.
I mean, even a website, it was like, who can build my website? Now it's like, it's pretty much a turnkey solution and you can do it by yourself. And you don't even
Yes,
have to know what's behind the door.
exactly.
So how was COVID for you as a whole? I mean, did you find that, I mean, certainly life changed. You were like locked up in your apartment. But did you find anything, and so much of that industry just, put their foot on the gas during that time? What did you find about yourself and learn about, where you wanted to be and, how you wanted to interact during that time?
Well, I definitely was reminded of the fact that I really like people. I'm like 99th percentile. Yeah, very extroverted. And I also really enjoy spending time alone reading. I read a ton of books last year. That was one of the, bonuses of COVID, was just like, well, got nothing else to do, so I guess I'll read. I read, 60 books or so. Um, but I think for me, I just realized, like, I actually very much like interfacing with people, and I get a lot of energy from that. And so it was a little bit, depressing, especially at the beginning, to be honest, when I wasn't really seeing people. I was also obviously a bit of an odd timing situation for me work wise, because I joined Andreessen and then 4 days later we shut down the offices. And so I was basically like all remote. I think for me, the bonus of that has been being able to spend more time in New York, and not having to be exclusively in San Francisco, which has been where the firm has historically centered operations. But yeah, I mean, I think there's always, you know, at least I was relatively very lucky in terms of how my COVID went. I think obviously some people had far more challenging experiences, but yeah, I think the social isolation is difficult, especially if you're a very extroverted person. And so I'm glad that now things are normal-ish, at least in New York. It feels mostly pretty normal. So yeah.
For sure. Well, thank you so much for coming on. I mean, this is definitely a topic that people are fascinated with, and they don't know where to get the information.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the online social networks, crypto, Twitter, whatever, Reddit, Discord channels can be a great place to learn. We have also put together at A16Z a couple of canons, and even a crypto startup school, all of which are online. So we have an NFT specific canon, and then
Oh,
just like a
fantastic.
general. Yeah, exactly. And also future.com has quite a lot of crypto content. So those are, I think, some places to start. And there's varying degrees of technical complexity, from very basic to pretty involved. So there should be a pretty extensive menu for people to start learning, and then build a base and go from there. So I might point people to those as a starting place.
Great. So 101.
Yeah, exactly. 101 to, very advanced. So depends. Whatever people want, they can find.
Well, thanks so much. So great to meet you. I've only heard fabulous things. And eventually we will see each other face to face. All
Absolutely. Thanks so much. Talk to you
right.
soon.
Take care. All right. Bye bye.